Prince Harry found himself in a quiet room, having just witnessed his father, King Charles, dismiss his last desperate appeal. The narrative of how things reached this point is far more complex than a simple family dispute. It is the tale of a monarchy establishing a firm boundary, not through force, but via a meticulously crafted palace declaration stating unequivocally that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles have been revoked, and this ruling is irreversible. Truthfully, the fact that the institution frames this as constitutional clarity, while Harry sits at home ripping the notice to shreds, makes the entire ordeal fascinating. Before delving deeper into the true implications for the royal household, ensure you subscribe to our channel for all the latest news updates. Charles cast his gaze down at the document and paused at the handwritten notes regarding Archie and Lilibet. The sovereign read them over twice. Then he laid the petition flat on his desk, resting a hand upon it as if physical pressure could stop the inevitable. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles were royal privileges bestowed by the Crown, effectively tethering Harry and Meghan to the establishment even after they ceased their official duties. Erasing them would do more than alter a couple of names. It would sever the final legitimate link between the pair and the palace. Harry awaited the reply with a silent conviction he dared not voice. He wished his father would distinguish personal familial sorrow from institutional discipline. He anticipated fury, stipulations, and reprimands, but he genuinely thought Charles might postpone the public decree for the sake of the grandchildren. That illusion shattered when the response was delivered. The communication presented no room for bargaining, no secret compromises, and no assurances of future reassessments. It declared that the conflict had escalated past the point of mending and had transformed into an issue of supreme royal authority. The locked door altered everything. Charles recognized that the royal apparatus, the organizational framework handling the sovereign's obligations and verdicts, was already pushing toward finalization. A royal aide walked in holding the statement, its phrasing cleared, and the publication schedule locked in. Harry's plea had found its way to the king prior to the broadcast, yet the bureaucratic gears driving the ruling had started grinding much earlier. The sovereign possessed the power to halt it. He opted not to. Harry absorbed the rejection in absolute silence. Meghan observed his face shift before he ultimately uttered that the honors were stripped. He did not raise his voice. He simply gazed at the concluding sentence where his father emphasized the permanence of the choice. Still, another grievance lurked beneath that judgment. An unnamed figure within the family ranks had maintained that the Sussex titles could not be shielded any longer, and Harry remained unaware of whose influence had tipped the scales so heavily. As the palace gates shut around Charles's ruling, the focus pivoted to those caught on opposing ends of the divide and to the deep-seated emotional injuries that made any middle ground virtually unattainable. This was never just an argument over two aristocratic labels. For Charles, it served as a trial of whether a monarch could safeguard the throne without annihilating what was left of the bond with his youngest child. For Harry, it provided confirmation that every pathway back to his relatives had been definitively barred. And for Meghan, observing from an ocean away, the resolution delivered a harsh reality. The establishment was no longer viewing their departure as a passing phase. Harry kept his phone near, but remained speechless. Meghan watched him process the denial, noticed his respiration decelerate, and comprehended the situation before he even uttered a word. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles were prestigious markers given by the monarch, inextricably linking their outward personas to the throne. Forfeiting them peeled away the ultimate official tag, associating their endeavors and union with the system they had exited. Charles stayed in his seat after sanctioning the release. The monarch glanced at a vacant chair where his youngest had previously debated, smiled, and anticipated the start of family gatherings. He recognized that this move might secure the crown's dominance, but it could simultaneously shatter any delicate push for harmony. Harry was stripped of his rank. The king dreaded he was stripped of a son. Meghan ultimately voiced the question neither was eager to resolve. Was this merely concerning public application, or had the institution made the revocation absolute? Harry glared at the concluding line. His quietness conveyed all she needed to know. She inquired if Archie and Lilibet would consequently face different treatment. He was unable to guarantee they would escape the fallout. William approached the phrasing with a stricter resolve. The heir felt that an aristocratic designation should not function as a defensive barrier for individuals who criticized the establishment while extracting influence from its legacy. Nevertheless, his stance was deeply personal. Every allegation from the Sussex camp had cast a shadow over his spouse, his father, and the legacy he was bound to defend. The concluding phrase nearly presented a loophole. An early version hinted that the titles could be re-evaluated should the situation evolve. William eliminated that part. Based on a recorded internal summary drafted post-meeting, he insisted that ambiguous wording would merely spawn an endless loop of requisitions, leaks, and societal scrutiny. Charles reviewed the amended text and opted not to reinstate the deleted portion. Harry was convinced his older brother had shut them out. Meghan was convinced the institution had demolished their ultimate shield. Charles was convinced that procrastinating would exacerbate the destruction, yet nobody grasped that a single confidential clash had turned years of resentment into a decree the throne could never backtrack on. To comprehend why Charles denied even his youngest son's ultimate plea, the narrative must rewind to the intimate meeting where Harry breached a boundary the palace had explicitly cautioned him to avoid. For several months, the institution had endured critiques, tell-all chats, allegations, and embarrassments. However, no single incident independently provoked the withdrawal of the Sussex titles. The ultimate breaking point occurred during a confidential Windsor mediation session when Harry presented a series of ultimatums to Charles, demanding that ongoing access, formal acknowledgements, and protective assurances be the cost of harmony. A solitary phrase within that paperwork shifted the mood in the room and persuaded William that the current dynamic was unsustainable. Harry walked into the gathering bearing years of suppressed fury he had never let go of. Charles observed his child place the documents onto the table, while William sat firmly across the divide. The Windsor summit was intended to detach relational mending from official standing. This meant they were to debate private healing without guaranteeing roles, formalities, or perks. That differentiation was crucial because every botched gathering and pointed claim had obscured the line separating the relatives from the monarchy. Charles had opposed revoking the honors for one specific cause. The sovereign worried the maneuver would appear punitive and cast Archie and Lilibet under a dark cloud generated by adults. He had stalled evaluations, toned down press leaks, and dismissed harsh strategies. Harry sensed that reluctance was present, and he showed up trusting it could be transformed into a bargaining chip. The atmosphere in the room grew tense when Harry outlined his terms. He informed his father that tranquility was impossible unless he and Meghan were granted formal ceremonial roles, protective guarantees, and entry to state affairs under conditions they co-authored. William shoved his seat backward. The older sibling questioned if familial relations were currently being dangled as leverage in a transaction. Harry refuted the idea of coercing anyone, yet the implication lingered heavily. One specific demand altered the landscape. Harry's draft dictated that the Sussex designation must be immunized against any prospective evaluations, even if he and Meghan never took up working royal tasks again. An aristocratic privilege is a tribute bestowed by the ruler, wielding clout, precisely because it originates from the monarchy. To William, rendering it forever immune would divorce the prestige from the actual duty. To Charles, it twisted a hurting son's appeal into an outright challenge against sovereign authority. Harry collected his documents after his father declined to respond right away. He departed assuming the quietness indicated wavering. In reality, Charles paused until the exit was shut, glanced at William, and ordered the constitutional dossiers regulating royal privileges to be delivered to him that very night. Based on a documented record composed after the tense sit-down, the sovereign issued a single directive. Every single alternative was to be scrutinized. The Windsor clash initiated the confidential evaluation, but it simultaneously laid the foundation for a much deeper heartache. Charles granted Harry one last secluded meeting where the two men could articulate what endless press releases never managed to convey. No consultants mediated between them. No press corps lurked beyond the walls. Charles and Harry confronted each other purely as parent and child, though the weight of the institution loomed in every pause. Harry questioned whether the sovereign genuinely meant to obliterate the rank gifted to him on his matrimonial day. Charles replied that nobody was attempting to erase who he was. He then dropped the statement that effectively terminated the debate. Harry was not permitted to discard the burdens of institutional existence while insisting on endless possession of its accompanying prestige. Harry leaned in, unwilling to let the statement rest. The intimate lounge had been emptied of handlers, attorneys, and staff, ensuring nothing could be pinned on the bureaucratic machine. An aristocratic rank is an accolade distributed by the ruler, projecting societal weight solely because it flows from the throne. Charles clarified that the reassessment wasn't about wiping out his offspring, but analyzing if that prestige could persist after prolonged detachment from official duties. The bitter accusation landed heavily. Harry informed his father that William's destiny clearly outweighed his own respect. and that every ruling now appeared crafted to shield the successor while penalizing the secondary son. Charles clutched the armrest of his seat. The monarch maintained a steady volume. He stated that affection did not equate to abandoning all protocols whenever his second son felt alienated. Harry pressed harder. He demanded to know if William had orchestrated the stripping, and if the heir had drafted the ultimate phrasing himself. Charles declined to deflect the responsibility. The ruler, he asserted, bore the weight of the decree entirely alone. A sovereign is the active ruler, the individual holding ultimate constitutional jurisdiction over state honors. That response offered Harry no solace. It only made the dismissal sting on a profoundly deeper level. The quiet shattered when Harry issued one final petition. He pleaded that Meghan keep the Duchess styling even if his own was revoked, reasoning she shouldn't be stripped of a status linked to their union. Charles declined with a shake of his head. He recognized the denial would hurt both of them, yet safeguarding a single honor would leave the identical paradox intact and spark another vicious dispute instantly. Her styling derived from the identical sovereign decree as his, and the monarch refused to fracture a singular ruling into isolated exemptions. Harry stood up gradually. He was convinced William had orchestrated the machinery and that his father was merely shielding the heir. However, a recorded breakdown of the secluded summit eventually revealed a far more intricate reality. Charles had not moved under a solitary influence. A coalition had taken shape within the household, and each participant had arrived at the exact same verdict, for entirely distinct motivations. The exit shut after Harry left. Yet, in the adjacent chamber, a different dossier was pending, one exposing how William, Anne, and the sovereign had collectively finalized his destiny. Harry assumed his older brother had manipulated the entire situation, but the resolution did not stem from William's fury independently. Behind the imposing walls, a trio of senior figures had forged a tense consensus. Charles desired equilibrium, William insisted on uniformity, and Princess Anne worried that persistent indecision would undermine every forthcoming protocol of the institution. Their incentives varied, but their final stance was uniform. The Sussex markers had morphed into something beyond inherited accolades. They had become emblems of a clash the establishment could no longer suppress. William set the document next to the Windsor records and initiated the dialogue. The heir contended that royal markers could not evolve into permanent private enterprises, disconnected from actual labor, while still siphoning prestige from the ruler. A sovereign is the presiding monarch whose authorization grants aristocratic honors their legitimacy. To him, the dispute had transcended vengeance. It centered on whether the institution could mandate obligation from the masses while permitting a single anomaly to endure indefinitely. Anne responded with even sharper precision. The Princess Royal cautioned that the precedent, the standard a single ruling establishes for subsequent scenarios, would survive everyone present if the prestige was left intact without the accompanying labor. Upcoming generations would inherit chaos regarding where perks stopped and actual obligations commenced. She brought out records from the Windsor clash, saved in an official log, proving Harry desired perpetual safeguarding for the Sussex styling, while dismissing any comeback under the establishment's current parameters. Charles heard them out without interjecting. The king walked to the glass and confessed that executing the mandate might permanently alienate his son. His tone remained steady, but William detected the underlying apprehension. The heir apparent countered that the ambiguity was already damaging all involved. Catherine faced revitalized hostility. Charles bore the immense pressure, and Archie and Lilibet were caught in a crossfire they never opted into. The chamber went completely silent as Anne slid the dossier toward her sibling. She did not rejoice. She pointed out that stalling had previously shielded Harry, but currently, it only shielded the ongoing feud. William concurred, although he stressed the ultimate declaration must avoid sounding boastful. Nobody desired a triumph. They simply needed a conclusion definitive enough to prevent the establishment from being dragged back into the exact same warfare. Charles authorized it only after appending a single directive in his own handwriting. The broadcast must absolutely not disparage Harry, Meghan, Archie, or Lilibet. The sovereign could strip institutional rank, but he refused to let the palace machinery assault his bloodline in the process. The decree was set, yet polite phrasing could not cushion the aftermath, and the initial crumbling commenced domestically. The institution branded it constitutional clarity, but for Harry and Meghan, the phrasing felt akin to an expulsion from the final chamber they still inhabited within the monarchy's legacy. The morning following the validation, everything appeared normal. Yet simultaneously, the entire landscape had shifted. The residence was quiet. The toddlers adhered to their standard rhythms, and mobile devices kept buzzing on the kitchen island. But every notification bore the identical terminology: former Duke, former Duchess, titles stripped. Harry stared down at a physical printout of the decree, as if the phrasing might magically reconfigure itself. Meghan reviewed it once, set it aside, and posed the inquiry neither was equipped to address. What is left for us now? Harry clutched the sheet until the borders crumpled. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex classifications had been sovereign stylings, official labels tethering the duo to the throne and civic duty. Their given names stayed the same, but every introduction, business tie-in, formal correspondence, and event billing would henceforth lack the terminology that had molded their public faces since their nuptials. The deprivation carried weight, because it altered how the globe would perceive them and how the establishment would segregate itself from their endeavors. The quiet was shattered when Harry ripped the document in two. He glared at the fragments, panting heavily, then stooped down and collected them almost instantly. The rage provided a fleeting burst of release, but it failed to undo the significance of the rank. It represented his matrimony, his standing in the lineage, and the ultimate civic tie to an existence he once assumed would never entirely cast him out. Meghan maintained her composure until she pulled open a drawer and uncovered a vintage wedding itinerary. The phrasing Duke and Duchess of Sussex still rested below their names, pristine and unaffected by the chaos that ensued. She traced a finger across the text, shut the drawer, and remained mute. Her restraint held firm, but Harry sensed the deep degradation simmering beneath it. Their consultants reached out with urgent cautions. Charities were drafting new profiles. Corporate allies were scrubbing aristocratic ties, and news syndicates had already swapped active ranks for past ones. Based on a recorded internal memo, the modifications were propagating much quicker than anticipated. The ruling was no longer confined to palace stationery. It was infiltrating every agreement, subtitle, announcement, and civic registry tied to their brand. Harry's mobile device buzzed once more. Charles had transmitted a confidential text conveying grief, though lacking remorse. The monarch penned that he comprehended the heartache and continued to cherish his boy. Still, the decree was final. That distinction cut deeper than the actual press release. Grief implied his father mourned the fracture. Lacking remorse implied he would opt for the identical resolution if given the chance. With the designations revoked and Charles unwilling to budge, Harry directed his focus toward William. Beneath the mountain of grievances, he wished a single slice of honesty might alter the trajectory. He desperately needed to know if his older sibling had pushed for the revocation or merely tolerated it when Charles prioritized the crown. There were no aides, no scripted talking points, and no bureaucratic jargon to shelter behind. When William and Harry ultimately communicated, the dialogue kicked off with hostility, but culminated in something neither sibling anticipated: raw candor. Harry aggressively questioned if William had aimed to degrade him. The heir apparent replied that degradation was never the objective. The objective was terminating a paradox that had tainted every push for a ceasefire. Then, William unveiled what Charles had shielded Harry from discovering. Harry had previously rejected arbitration because he felt every formal pathway distorted the siblings' true intentions. Arbitration is a supervised dialogue facilitated by an impartial third party to assist conflicting sides in speaking without risk. This time around, no consultant padded the dialogue. No palace staffer shuttled notes between the men. William responded frankly, conceding he had backed the stripping of the honors, but refuting that he manipulated Charles or accelerated the broadcast. Harry's fury escalated before his volume did. He argued the rank was more than a mere tag. It tethered him to his nuptials, his armed forces tenure, his late grandmother's blessing, and the destiny he once believed was his birthright. Having it revoked felt akin to watching those cherished milestones being stamped as null and void. William heard him out, then confessed he simply didn't know how to rely on his brother anymore. Even so, the heir maintained he never desired to see Harry obliterated from the lineage. The silence shifted when William disclosed what the official statement had masked. According to a recorded log of their confidential chat, Charles had postponed the decree multiple times. The sovereign had additionally excised aggressive phrasing that might have charged Harry and Meghan with capitalizing on their royal ties. He had opted for moderation even while cementing finality. Harry ceased his defensive posture. For the initial time, he grasped that his father's denial did not stem purely from malice. Charles was convinced that further stalling would exacerbate the feud, prompt bolder ultimatums, and compromise the establishment's capacity to draw lines. An institutional boundary is a guideline dividing familial warmth from state-sanctioned perks, and the ruler had concluded that specific line could not shift any further. William refrained from requesting absolution. Harry refrained from extending it. Nevertheless, the acrimony within him morphed into a profound mourning, softer yet much harder to combat. The siblings concluded the conversation without making amends, but crucially, without issuing another ultimatum. Outside the bounds of that phone call, the tension was mounting exponentially. Publications readied special print runs, networks wiped their programming slates, and household personnel were ordered to provide zero justifications for the ruling. Harry's private anguish was on the verge of becoming global entertainment, whereas William's cautious candor would stay shielded from the masses. What commenced as an agonizing domestic choice now breached the estate walls, saturated the front pages, and compelled society to debate if Charles had championed the throne or forsaken his own flesh and blood. By dawn, the ruling was no longer a confidential, constitutional, or strictly managed affair. It was the property of the masses. Networks broke into their standard feeds. Pundits debated dedication versus retribution, and masses congregated outside the Buckingham gates under a canopy of glowing devices. A single publication summarized the complete disaster in a few stark words splashed across the front page. The Crown chooses duty. Underneath the banner sat two images, Charles isolated at his workspace, and Harry exiting a vehicle with a downcast gaze. Charles observed the morning news coverage without a word. The broadcast labeled the ruling the most absolute royal detachment since Harry and Meghan departed their working capacities, signifying the duo had abandoned their active duties while retaining a civic tie to the throne. That tie now appeared completely severed. Palace personnel reiterated a single talking point. This was constitutional clarity, a structural effort to align prestige with actual duty, not a maneuver of private vindictiveness. The phrasing still felt deeply personal. Charles listened, as a host characterized the event as a patriarch officially shutting the gates on his offspring. The monarch grabbed the controller and powered down the screen before the broadcast concluded. Across the ocean, Harry viewed footage of the masses swarming the palace exterior. Certain placards applauded the commitment to duty, while others blasted the institution for its ruthlessness. His confidential appeal had morphed into a global spectacle, and random people now dissected his trauma as if they owned a stake in it. One network transitioned from the formal decree directly into clips from Harry and Meghan's nuptials. The juxtaposition was savage. An event previously framed as a beacon of modernization now played adjacent to text, confirming the Sussex designations were obliterated. Meghan watched the broadcast once, then averted her eyes. Harry remained glued to the monitor, listening to the jubilation of the past smash into the harsh judgments of the present. William declined to view the ruling as a triumph. The heir ordered his aides to refrain from leaking negative narratives about his brother, ensuring no staffer supplied antagonistic rumors or harmful private specifics to the press. Based on a recorded internal mandate, he wished the chapter shut without inflicting further embarrassment. The impending monarch grasped that absolute closure might shield the throne, but reveling in it would only aggravate the injury. The uproar intensified before it eventually started to wane. Publications selected their allegiances, networks looped the identical footage, and the estate perimeters transformed into a theater for outrage, devotion, mourning, and accusation. Yet absolutely none of it could resolve the lingering question buried deep within the family structure. For the initial time, global definitiveness laid bare the internal void that polished phrasing had unsuccessfully masked for both men. Past the sensational headlines and fractured public, Charles and Harry were stranded with zero ranks to squabble over and no bureaucratic scapegoats to target. There was only the ultimate psychological toll of the trajectory they had mutually shaped. Ultimately, there was no spectacular pivot, no covert middle ground, and no reinstatement lurking behind a different estate corridor. The Sussex stylings were revoked permanently. Charles held his ground. William shouldered the weight of backing the mandate, and Harry was compelled to face an existence no longer shielded by the throne's prestige. However, the ultimate significance of the event was not merely a ruler vanquishing a defiant child. It signified that the institution had prioritized absolute clarity, fully aware that this clarity demanded a devastatingly personal sacrifice. Charles reviewed the ultimate dossier one last time before it was officially archived. Administrative logs, recognized stylings, formal mentions, and upcoming event protocols had all been modified, rendering the erasure absolute in practice as well as in text. A recognized styling is the formal title applied in state paperwork and civic events. This detail held weight because every subsequent summons, press release, and archival entry would now showcase Harry and Meghan, minus the honorific that had tethered their output to the monarchy. The sovereign did not shred his son's petition. He creased it meticulously and stowed it inside a personal compartment, safeguarding the text beneath the controversy and the boy beneath the fury. Charles had championed sovereign dominance, but he couldn't falsely claim the resolution delivered tranquility. The establishment stood more secure. The patriarch sat isolated with the ultimate toll. Harry confronted the identical reality from the opposite shore. He placed the vintage wedding itinerary back into storage, no longer handling it as evidence of a rank he currently held. It had transitioned into a keepsake from a finalized era. Meghan recognized their outward endeavors would press on, yet every new venture would now operate without the aristocratic stamp that previously linked them to the system they had abandoned. William took no pride in the outcome. The heir grasped that securing the legacy had failed to mend his relatives. It merely forged a barrier thick enough to prevent the warfare from swallowing the entire institution. Based on a documented log of his solitary musings, he considered the mandate essential, though he never labeled it painless. No ovations ensued, because every individual comprehended the exact price that equilibrium had extracted from them. Harry ultimately grasped that Charles's dismissal was not a bargaining tactic. It was an irrevocable sentence. Liberating himself from state obligations had yielded autonomy, but that autonomy now required the relinquishment of royal advantages. The official release finalized the dispute regarding ranks, and history logged the outcome with absolute clarity. The establishment would persist. Harry would navigate the future stripped of its armor, and Charles would bear the silent mourning of a ruler who prioritized his crown, even when the ultimate casualty was his own son.